Okay, let's dive in then. We're looking at the recent political buzz in the Netherlands today,
Mhm.
and our main source is that a Famen podcast from The Telegraph. It's pretty fresh, recorded just the other day.
Yeah.
And our mission really is to kind of pull out the key things they talked about and figure out, what it all might mean going forward.
What struck me straight away is they jumped right into something pretty significant, didn't they? These allegations about a conspiracy of the official top against Khadija Arib, the former speaker.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just like whispers. There's that court ruling coming mid-June, right?
Yeah.
About her former spokesperson allegedly leaking stuff.
Hmm.
And the podcast, well, they laid out what sounds like some really underhanded dealings suggested in court, like cameras being turned off so someone could get at documents about Arab. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. I mean, it calls into question the basic integrity of how things work there.
Yeah.
The hosts were clearly worried about this idea of the unelected officials, the Emsal Kitab,
Mm-hmm.
potentially undermining someone who was actually elected. They even use that phrase, a state within a state.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's even partly true, well, what does that say about democratic checks and balances,
Exactly. And then there's Arab's own history. The podcast kind of reminds you she's tough. She's seen political fights before.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the attempts inside her own party, the PVDA, to sideline her? And yet she still became speaker, so you wonder, could this be connected maybe to when she tried reforming the parliamentary organization early on?
Stepping on toes, maybe.
Yeah, upsetting established, kingdoms, as the podcast put it,
Right.
creating enemies who might be looking for payback now.
It certainly highlights how these seemingly internal admin issues can get tangled up with real power struggles, and the consequences can be huge.
Okay, so then the conversation shifts, and it's quite a moment, actually. Peter Omtzig's farewell from Parliament.
Ah, yes.
Apparently very emotional. Tears, embracing Arab, Renske Leitner. It sounds like his departure really resonated.
Well, what's interesting is how people reacted, isn't it? The podcast mentioned a column trying to be balanced about his career.
Right.
But even that column seemed to get really mixed reactions. Some thought it was fair, others way too soft. Just like Omtzig himself, really. Polarizing.
Totally. And the podcast looked at Omtzig's own comments after leaving, apparently blaming the media, the toxic climate,
Mm-hmm.
without much self-reflection, maybe. And then there was that bit about former colleague from Volkskrant supposedly confronting him,
Oh, yeah, that was quite something.
alleging Omtzigt had told journalists to target the PVV. I mean, that's a pretty big claim. It definitely complicates the picture of him just being a victim.
It really does. If that actually happened, it makes you reassess his whole role, doesn't it?
Yes.
Suggests a more complex game being played behind the scenes.
And then you have Martin Bosma's farewell speech, that metaphor. Knightley walks in a dark forest, wishing him sun-drenched, wide plains.
Very poetic.
Yeah, but the host suggested maybe a bit of a double meaning there. A little critique mixed in with the warmth. Knowing Bosma's way with words.
It's possible, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's definitely open to interpretation. Bosma choosing those specific words. It could be acknowledging the difficult path Omtzig took, maybe the isolation, as well as just wishing him well. Cleverly put, perhaps.
And ultimately, the podcast hosts seem to land on a pretty clear view of Omtzigt. Great at digging into issues like the childcare benefit scandal, no doubt.
Absolutely.
But maybe not cut out for leadership. They even mentioned anecdotes, didn't they, from people in CDA, D66, VVD, SP, lots of negative experiences. Some people apparently left The Hague because of him.
Yeah, those stories paint a picture of someone, well, maybe intense, uncompromising, effective in one way maybe, but causing a lot of friction interpersonally in the Hague bubble.
Right. It's a real contrast to the public image, the investigator.
Definitely.
But then, just to complicate it further, they mentioned that LinkedIn post from Ingrid van Engelshoven.
Ah, yes, the state secretary.
Praising his genuine interest in the prison system, saying he was collaborative on that front. It's such a different taste.
It is, and it's a really important reminder, isn't it? People aren't just one thing. Different people, different contexts, you get different experiences. Stops you from just creating a simple good guy, bad guy story.
Yeah. Although, things got a bit weird, didn't they? That reported comment at his farewell, calling Van Engelshoven the Jill Biden of NSC, and even representing evil in The Hague. I mean, wow, that's some seriously loaded language. Tells you a lot about the atmosphere.
It really does. That kind of talk just shows how deep the divisions run and how personal these political fights can get. Calling someone evil, That's pretty stark. Reveals a lot of animosity under the surface.
So switching gears a bit, with Umsik gone, there's this gap in NSC. And Nicolene van Vroonhoven seems to be, well, stepping up somewhat.
Yeah, she's been more visible.
The podcast noted she was back on morning TV pretty quickly after he left. And they mentioned maybe a tendency for clumsy interviews.
Well, what seems significant is the change in her approach, maybe.
Yeah.
They pointed out how she seemed reluctant to talk leadership before, but now she's making more definite statements.
Right.
Could be her own decision, could be internal party stuff pushing her forward, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. They highlighted her saying NSC knew about the coalition changing its stance on Israel, and that comment about letting MPs fly out expressed different views. And the podcast made that interesting comparison to D66 back in the day, under Balkenende II, when they were low in the polls.
The reacting to everything strategy.
Exactly,
Yeah.
suggesting maybe NSC is falling into that trap, just chasing headlines, which didn't really work out for D66 back then.
No, it's a real risk for parties, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Getting caught up in the day-to-day noise instead of having a clear long-term plan. The D66 example is a good warning, really.
They also mentioned Diederik Boomsma's idea, ankle bracelets for rejected asylum seekers, maybe as an example of some internal jockeying within NSC. But they stressed, it's not certain Van Vroonhoven will be the actual leader. And they speculated NSC might try to focus on pensions, grab voters unhappy with the new system.
That could make sense. Pensions are a huge issue for a lot of people. If NSC can carve out a clear position there, it might give them a distinct profile now Umsik's gone.
Yeah, define themselves a bit more.
But, as they said, whether it actually clicks with voters, that's always the question, isn't it?
True. Then there were personnel changes. Kees Berkhuis leaving the VVD, he was a big deal behind the scenes, right? A key spin doctor.
Oh, absolutely.
And now he's heading off to be editor-in-chief at WNL. That sounds like a loss for the VVD, losing that strategic brain.
It really is significant. The podcast emphasized how influential he was during the Root years. Losing someone with that depth of experience in strategy and communication, yeah, that's a blow for any party.
They also briefly brought up Eibelchi Berkmos's book, criticizing the VVD, feeling overlooked.
And drew a parallel to Van Vroonhoven's situation, perhaps.
Yeah, that idea of internal dynamics, who gets recognized, who feels left out, seems like a common theme in politics.
Berkmos's story, it kind of lifts the lid a bit on those internal party workings, doesn't it? Where maybe things aren't always as smooth or fair as they look from the outside.
Okay, so then D66, their current position, particularly on the Gaza conflict, that came up quite a bit.
Yes, their motion to suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement.
Right. CDA supporting it, but probably not enough votes to pass. Still, it's a clear signal, isn't it? Putting distance between themselves and their coalition partner, the VVD, on a really sensitive topic.
It is. And for D66, well, it probably serves a few purposes. Marks them out from others, maybe appeals to certain voters who feel strongly about this.
But that tweet, the official D66 account, with Jan Paternotte, how many children must die before parties like the VVD draw a red line?
Oof, yeah, that was strong.
Very strong. The podcast host really picked up on that. How that language might land with the VVD. Could it actually damage future coalition chances between the two liberal parties? That kind of direct hit can leave scars,
Definitely. That kind of very direct, very emotional attack. It can create real bad blood. It might fire up D66 supporters, sure, but the podcast is right. It risks alienating potential partners.
Especially the VVD, who you'd assume will likely be in the mix for any future government. Makes you wonder about D66's long game.
Yeah. The podcast acknowledged, some on the left probably cheered that tweet on.
Sure.
But they did question how effective it is long term for actual relationships, for forming governments down the line. And they mentioned other things too, didn't they? Like Sigrid Kaag's trip to Argentina, suggesting maybe a pattern of missteps.
Yeah, things that feed into a perception maybe of a party that's struggling a bit to find a consistent, strategically sound footing right now.
And looking at the wider opposition, the podcast felt there isn't really a dominant figure grabbing the headlines at the moment.
They even had that anecdote about Frans Timmermans getting less media attention than Geert Wilders lately.
Yeah.
Maybe because international stuff isn't front and center right now, so Timmermans' profile is a bit lower.
That makes sense. Media attention ebbs and flows, doesn't it? If the big stories aren't in your wheelhouse, your visibility naturally dips.
They also noted PVDA-grown links seem pretty quiet on big policy differences. More talk about the merger itself than, what they stand for separately or together right now.
Yeah, focus seems internal.
Interestingly, they thought Femke Halsema actually has a higher media profile than Timmermans currently, mentioning her statements on Israel, the Dutch government's role.
Well, yeah, by speaking out on those hot-button issues, she can keep herself in the public eye, even if the wider PVD AgriLinks group isn't making big policy waves right now.
And they even brought in local politics. Amsterdam, Utrecht, mayors weighing in on international issues. The podcast hosts were a bit cynical, suggesting maybe it's a way to distract from local problems.
Like unpaid bills in Amsterdam, yeah.
Exactly. Shift the focus. It's an old political trick, I guess.
It is. Use the big emotionally charged national or international debates to maybe draw attention away from tricky local stuff where progress is slow. It happens.
Okay, briefly, that clash between Marjolaine Faber from PVV and State Secretary Vanderburg.
The FPing trip.
Yeah, sending asylum seekers to the theme park. Faber hitting out, saying it contradicts the government's tough migration stance. Then counter-arguments about kids' rights, maybe baking cookies instead. Really captures the tension around asylum, doesn't it?
It perfectly sums up the different worldviews, doesn't it? Faber's reaction is pure PVV line, restrictive. The counter-argument is bringing the humanitarian angle, the kids' welfare. Two sides of the coin.
And the podcast noted, the minister is supposed to be tightening policy, so maybe those trips will get cut. But also that the COA, the reception agency, is independent.
Right.
And the PM didn't seem too bothered. The hosts suggested Faber focusing on this might actually distract from bigger asylum law changes.
Yeah, focusing on something visible, symbolic.
Yeah.
It's a good way to fire up your base, even if it doesn't change the underlying policy much.
Then the controversy around Baldas Singh, the National Coordinator Against Discrimination and Racism.
Yes, that interview in Qatar.
Saying the West is at war with Muslims. The hosts had already been critical of that role existing, apparently, but these remarks coming from him, that's pretty incendiary.
It really is. I mean, it's such a broad, sweeping statement from a Dutch national coordinator.
Yeah.
Especially saying it to Qatari media. It raises serious questions about his judgment, doesn't it? And what it means for Dutch diplomacy.
Faber called for a proper discussion about it, and the podcast touched on that complex relationship the Netherlands has with Qatar. They clearly felt it was questionable, him saying that there.
Yeah, given how sensitive things are with Qatar, energy, security, all sorts, those comments could easily backfire, have negative consequences for those ties. You have to be careful.
Okay, quick update they gave on the asylum dispersal law, the spreading sweat. Sounds like more delays, new questions being asked, even from NSC. Wilder's worried about obstruction, naturally. They explained a bit about committee votes. Sounds like it might get discussed just before the summer break, late June, early July maybe. Still facing hurdles, clearly.
It just shows how deeply divisive that whole issue remains, doesn't it? Even after all the negotiations, getting it through is still a battle.
Wow, okay. And just as we're wrapping up here, actually, breaking news coming in.
Oh.
Former D66 leader Jan Terlouw has passed away, aged 93. That's major news. End of a long, significant career.
Oh, wow. Yes, that is sad news. Jan Terlouw, absolutely a huge figure for D66. Stayed influential right to the end, really. A major loss for Dutch politics.
Yeah. The podcast mentioned Leon Brandsma's profile of him and, of course, his other career. Beloved children's author, King of Katoran, Winter in Wartime.
Classics.
Absolutely. They put him up there with Van Mierlo and Pechtold as one of D66's greats. And known for being well-liked, generally respected, wasn't he? Represent a certain kind of politics.
He really did. Maybe from a time with a bit more emphasis on consensus. A more measured tone, perhaps. Yeah, his passing definitely feels like the end of an era for D66, and maybe for Dutch politics more broadly.
They noted the respectful comments already coming in from current leaders, and acknowledged Els Borst, too, another huge figure for D66, of course.
Yes, important to remember her, too.
It kind of puts other things in perspective, doesn't it? They even briefly circled back to that point about smaller parties making noise, like Lorenz Dassen from Volt, comparing the U.S. to 1930s Germany, almost dismissing it now, in light of Terlouw's passing.
It does provide perspective. Terlouw's long life, his impact. It makes some of the day-to-day political spats seem a bit less significant, perhaps. A reminder of lasting legacies.
So yeah, bringing this all together, quite a snapshot of Dutch politics right now, isn't it? Internal party stuff, Arib, NSC, big leadership shifts with Omtzigt, D66 trying to find its way, Berkwise moving on, those constant policy fights over asylum. And now the passing of Jan Terlouw marking an endpoint for D66 in a way. A lot going on.
It really is. A period of real flux, you could say. Lots of maneuvering, lots of tension, both inside the parties and between them.
So here's something to maybe think about as we finish. How might all these internal things, the tensions, the personnel changes we talked about, how might they actually shape whatever coalition comes next? What are the unseen power games maybe influencing the future?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The health and the direction of these individual parties. That's going to be absolutely crucial for who governs next and how stable, how effective that government will be. Definitely something to watch.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Pleasure. A really fascinating look at things today.